At just 42 years old, Dorothy Arzner stunned Hollywood with a daring confession. She had filmed her own secret relationship into a movie. It was a revelation wrapped in shadows, whispered in studio corridors, feared by executives desperate to protect the Dream Factory's image. For decades, she had been the only woman directing films in an industry ruled by men, but behind the camera, she carried a truth far more dangerous than her gender. She had slipped her own love story onto the screen. Dorothy Emma Arzner was born in San Francisco in 1897, into a world that was rapidly changing, but still bound by rigid expectations. Her family relocated to Los Angeles when she was young, a move that placed her childhood in the very city that would later become the center of her destiny. Her father opened a restaurant that attracted actors, directors, and writers from the emerging film colony. For a girl with wide eyes and a restless spirit, it was an intoxicating education. The turn of the century was a time of invention and upheaval. Ragtime filled the air from piano rolls, women were still fighting for the vote, and silent pictures flickered in Nickelodeons with exaggerated gestures and painted sets. Boys were expected to be strong providers, girls to be dutiful wives. But Dorothy was different. She was tall, with striking features, and carried herself with an authority unusual for a young girl. Neighbors remembered her preferring pants to skirts, striding with confidence rather than modesty. Even as a child, she rejected roles assigned to her. The Arzner home was comfortable but far from extravagant. Dorothy attended school in Los Angeles, absorbing the rhythms of a city that thrummed with ambition. By the time she reached her late teens, the world had been shaken by the First World War. Young men marched off in uniforms, while women filled factories and hospitals. Dorothy herself briefly considered a career in medicine, enrolling at the University of Southern California with the goal of becoming a doctor. She studied anatomy and physiology, and she later joked that her time around cadavers prepared her for the sometimes lifeless acting she would face in Hollywood. Still, her ambitions were restless. The booming film industry was impossible to ignore. In the 1,910 seconds and early 1,920 seconds, Los Angeles was transforming into the film capital of the world. Studios like Paramount and Universal were rising out of orange groves and dusty streets. Dorothy, who often visited her father's restaurant filled with industry regulars, began to glimpse another kind of future. She saw powerful men giving orders and women reduced to smiling ornaments. She wondered why the stories of women were so rarely told. And when they were, why they rang false. The cultural climate around sexuality was deeply repressive. Homosexuality was whispered of only as scandal or sin, and same-sex love was buried under shame. Yet Dorothy, even in youth, sensed that her heart did not align with society's prescriptions. In letters and interviews later in life, she would reveal no shame in who she was, though the world tried to silence it. That resolve was born early, in the contrast between rigid social rules and the vivid, chaotic world of Hollywood's golden dawn. Her decision to abandon medicine and walk into a film studio was not a simple whim. It was the beginning of a rebellion. Dorothy Arzner did not enter Hollywood through glamour. She walked in through the back door, starting as a typist at famous Players Lasky, which would later become Paramount. With her sharp mind and relentless determination, she quickly moved into the cutting room, where reels of silent film unspooled like puzzles to be solved. Editing demanded precision, rhythm, and storytelling instinct, and Dorothy excelled. She could see where a scene dragged, where a look lingered too long, and where emotion could be sharpened with a single splice. In those years, Hollywood was a factory. Cameras cranked endlessly. Directors barked orders in leather chairs. Men dominated every position of power. Yet Dorothy, with her crisp suits and unwavering gaze, carved a space no one could deny. She earned a reputation as one of the finest cutters in the business, so trusted that she edited Blood and Sand in 1922, a prestige picture starring Rudolph Valentino. Her work was so acclaimed that she was promoted to screenwriting and eventually entrusted with directing her own films, a path almost unheard of for women at the time. Her first directorial assignment came in 1927 with Fashions for Women, a romantic comedy. It was light fare, but Dorothy's touch was undeniable. She balanced glamour with wit, showing that women on screen could be more than ornaments. Studio heads noticed. More projects followed, The Wild Party in 1929, starring Clara Bow, marked her bold transition to sound films. She cleverly rigged a microphone onto a fishing rod so Bow could move freely, a technique now considered the first boom mic. Dorothy wasn't just directing. She was inventing. By the early 1930 seconds, she was the only woman consistently directing major studio films. Her camera lingered on women's experiences with an empathy rare in the era. She gave her actresses dignity, desire, and complexity. Films like Merrily We Go to Hell and Christopher Strong dared to depict infidelity, ambition, and female strength without apology. Actresses adored working with her. Katharine Hepburn credited her with shaping her early career, while others felt protected by her calm authority on set. Still, her rise came with whispers. Dorothy often wore tailored suits, ties, and carried herself with a masculine assurance that unsettled Hollywood's rigid gender codes. Studio bosses tolerated it only because she delivered hit after hit. Yet behind every glance, behind every coded headline about her eccentric style, was the awareness that she was different. By the mid-1930 seconds, Dorothy Arzner was at the peak of her career, one of the few directors with the power to choose projects and the rare freedom to shape narratives from a woman's point of view. But as her fame rose, so too did the pressure to hide what she could not speak aloud. Dorothy Arzner's sets were more than workplaces. They were sanctuaries, away from the studio heads who watched every dollar and the gossip columnists who watched every move. Dorothy created spaces where women could breathe, laugh, and be seen. It was in those spaces that her private life quietly intertwined with her work. Throughout the 1930 seconds, Dorothy became closely connected with several actresses. She was rumored to have shared deep attachments with women like Alla Nazimova, the legendary silent star who hosted infamous sewing circle gatherings where Hollywood's closeted women could meet safely. These were not ordinary parties. Behind closed doors in Spanish-style mansions, women wore silk gowns, danced freely, and spoke of love they could never confess in public. Dorothy's presence at such gatherings placed her at the heart of Hollywood's hidden queer network. Her most enduring relationship, however, began in the early 1930 seconds with choreographer Marion Morgan. Marion was older, elegant, and already known for her all-female dance troupe that staged sensual performances inspired by myth and legend. Dorothy and Marion moved in together, living openly enough to be recognized as a pair, though society politely called them companions. Their partnership lasted for decades, with Marion often by Dorothy's side at public events. In a town of secrets, theirs was a carefully coded truth. Yet Dorothy also wove her feelings into her art. Biographers have noted how Christopher Strong, 1933, starring Katharine Hepburn as an aviatrix torn between love and independence, mirrored themes from Dorothy's own life. The camera lingered on Hepburn in her shimmering moth costume, wings stretched wide, an image of female power and vulnerability. For those who knew, it was a declaration of desire hidden in plain sight. Dorothy later admitted that much of her storytelling came from personal experience, a rare slip that hinted at more than audiences realized. Other films carried similar imprints. Dance, Girl, Dance in 1940, with Maureen O'Hara and Lucille Ball, framed female rivalry and desire with a subtle undercurrent of longing. Dorothy seemed determined to give women agency, even if she had to veil her own truth in metaphors. But secrecy carried a heavy cost. Gossip reporters speculated about her mannish dress, her refusal to marry, her close ties with actresses. Studios were wary. The production code, strictly enforced by the mid-1930 seconds, left no room for stories that even hinted at homosexuality. Dorothy knew she was treading a dangerous line, but she refused to conform. With Marion Morgan by her side, and a circle of trusted friends who understood, Dorothy continued to navigate Hollywood's glittering surface while guarding the deeper truth of her heart. Yet as by the late 1930 seconds, the Dream Factory had grown colder. The Hays Code now dictated what stories could be told, policing morality with an iron grip. Films hinting at forbidden love or ambiguous desire were cut apart or banned. For Dorothy Arzner, who had built her art on the quiet suggestion of women's longing, the restrictions struck like a cage closing. Rumors had long circled around her. Studio executives praised her talent, but whispered about her eccentricities. The press described her in coded terms: independent, unconventional, masculine. These were polite veils over a truth no one dared print. Every time she appeared in a tailored suit, every time she walked into a premiere with Marion Morgan, the risk of exposure deepened. The pressure began to mount. Paramount grew uneasy with her authority and the undertones in her films. Offers for projects slowed. By the time she directed Dance Girl, Dance in 1940, her style was seen as out of step with a changing industry. The studios wanted glossy escapism during wartime. Dorothy's stories, filled with female tension and hidden defiance, felt too sharp, too dangerous. Her personal life was not untouched. Marion remained loyal, but Dorothy felt the walls closing in. Friends warned her to be cautious. A careless word to the wrong columnist could end her career. Others in Hollywood had already been destroyed by innuendo alone. Dorothy's health began to suffer under the strain. She endured fainting spells, nervous exhaustion, and long periods of retreat from the studio lot. Finally, in the early 1940s, Dorothy stepped away. The official story was illness, exhaustion, and a need for rest. But those who knew her whispered that she had been pushed out by an industry no longer willing to tolerate her presence. After more than a decade of directing major films, she found herself sidelined, her career abruptly silenced. The fall was devastating. For a woman who had once stood as the only female director in Hollywood, the isolation was sharp. Her creative voice, once heard in the laughter and tears of audiences, was reduced to silence. At her lowest point, Dorothy confessed privately that she wondered if the industry had used her until it no longer needed her, and then cast her aside because of who she was. The crisis marked the end of her studio career. Though she would live many more years, Dorothy Arzner would never again direct a major Hollywood film. After the crisis of the early 1940s, Dorothy Arzner did not vanish. She simply turned her creative energy elsewhere. Retreating from the glare of Hollywood, she moved into teaching, mentoring young filmmakers at UCLA. In the classroom, away from studio politics, she found new purpose. Students recalled her sharp wit, her uncompromising honesty, and her insistence that film must come from lived truth. For many, she was the first woman director they had ever encountered, and her presence alone was revolutionary. Dorothy also worked in advertising during the 1950s, directing commercials when Hollywood's doors stayed closed. It was not the grand scale of feature films, but it kept her close to the craft she loved, and it allowed her to live more quietly with Marion Morgan, who remained her companion through these years. Their partnership, though rarely spoken of publicly, grew into a steady source of comfort. In a world where most such unions dissolved under secrecy and shame, Dorothy and Marion endured. The world outside was shifting. By the 1960s, social movements began to shake the rigid walls Dorothy had once faced. Feminism found new language, and younger women in Hollywood began to look back at her as a pioneer. She was invited to retrospectives, honored quietly, and recognized as the woman who had once broken through a wall no one else could breach. By the 1970s, Dorothy lived in relative obscurity in the desert near Palm Springs, but those who sought her out found her reflective rather than bitter. She watched the slow rise of directors like Barbara Loden and Elaine May, women who were still exceptions rather than the rule, and she remarked with dry humor that nothing in Hollywood changed quickly except fashion. Yet she also saw signs of hope. The conversations about women's equality and sexual liberation suggested that perhaps the world was inching closer to the honesty she had long embodied. When Marion Morgan passed away in 1971, Dorothy carried on alone, her grief evident but her dignity intact. She continued to host small gatherings at her home, welcoming students. Dorothy Arzner's story is not only about the rise and fall of a Hollywood pioneer, it is about the courage to live authentically in silence, the price of defying convention, and the cost of carrying love that could never be spoken aloud. She filmed her truth in glances, in coded lines of dialogue, in the way her camera lingered on women with tenderness rarely seen in that era. Her legacy is measured not only in the films she directed, but in the lives she touched. Generations of women filmmakers see in her a pathfinder, someone who opened a door even as it closed on her. And for those who lived with secrets, her life is a reminder that art can become a vessel for truth, even when society demands silence. When we look back at Dorothy Arzner, we see more than a director. We see a woman who turned repression into artistry, who lived with dignity beside the woman she loved, and who gave Hollywood its first glimpse of what it means to let women tell their own stories. Her life asks us, what is the cost of hiding, and what is the power of telling? The answer lies not only in history, but in the courage of those who continue to speak today. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories, and help us keep these legacies alive.